With the current seasonal airing of Hibike Euphonium Season 3 and Whisper Me a Love Song, which is to say nothing of what Jellyfish Can't Swim in the Night has pulled recently, or the success of girls band Cry or The Summer You Were There, it seems like Yuri has once again become the talk of the town in the anime community. Even other recent shows like The Magical Revolution of the Reincarnated Princess and the Genius Young Lady and Mobile Suit Gundam The Witch from Mercury managed to ignite collective attention and imagination about the often romantic or romance-hinted relationships between two girls or women. Trends come and go like anything else, but the endless fascination with Yuri content from the anime community at large makes it worth asking a question. Where exactly does Yuri come from within animanga, and what could we possibly call the first Yuri manga proper? But to do that, we need to start with talking a little bit about Japanese history, early manga, and when a shift towards Yuri content began. I should seriously stress that this is a gross oversimplification of a complex subject, and that any single video will never be able to encapsulate the entire history of such a complexity, not unless it's like 7 hours or something. Therefore, please do not take this background context portion as the sacrosanct be-all, end-all truth about something. Content like this, as is the case with some of my other videos about ideas or concepts within animanga, should be the inspiration or the start of a discussion, not the conclusion. With that out of the way, let's get to it. Chapter 1. An absurdly brief history of Japanese feminism. Because nothing says a good idea quite like a cis white guy talking about the feminist history of a country that he doesn't even belong to.
Is that the stupid idea train coming round the bend?
I'm sure that this will go perfectly fine. During the 1860s began the Meiji era of Japan, and marked a period of significant transformation for the country, with increasing influences in sciences, philosophies, and technologies from the Western world. Japan was transitioning away from being the more feudal nation that isolated itself from the world, as it was during the case of Admiral Perry's arrival in 1853, famously depicted in Stephen Sondheim's Pacific Overtures, to one that was more willing to embrace outsider concepts and innovation. It should be mentioned that despite the pre-existing overall isolationist perspective, it was not as though every single person or idea from outside Japanese borders was rejected, as even prior to the Meiji era, foreign advisors were often serving short contract positions within the shogunate government. Despite the period of transition having been started by the so-called Meiji Restoration, this time did not come without its share of violence, as notable incidents like the blood tax riots from the unhappy samurai class in the early 1870s, or the Satsuma Rebellion as forms of civil war, showed a reluctance by some to take in these new ideological and sociological constructs. Nevertheless, the process of Japan gradually adopting notions that the government and its citizenry had not truly considered before well and truly began. Among these shifts in perspective was increasing attention on women's rights and women's stations within Japan because, despite the widespread attempts to modernize Japan in several facets, women within Meiji-era Japan still found themselves as a population treated unfairly, with fewer legal rights, sexual freedoms, and political power, which could include outright bans for women in political spheres and spaces. Among the figures who called for a massive re-examination for the treatment of Japanese women was Kishida Toshiko, known by the pseudonym Shoin. In her famous Daughters in Boxes speech in 1883, she criticized the family system in Japan and argued that it hampered women's mental and emotional growth, and that a special box with no walls and true freedom would allow the greater liberation of women into Japanese society socially, politically, and intellectually, and that while hastily constructing such metaphysical boxes would take time was necessary so as to not inadvertently cause resentment or hatred from the women it sought to help. Kishida's positions also happened to coincide with the creation of Seito, also translated as Blue Stocking, a magazine created by women to essentially articulate the desire for greater gender equality and a penning of the social and political problems that women faced in contemporary Japan. Running for about 5 years, it is one of the earliest examples of modern Japanese feminist literature. To be clear, Blue Stocking is not the only magazine that dealt with these matters, nor did it necessarily create a feminist movement in Japan, as other writers such as Higuchi Ichio and groups like Meiji Six Society were voicing their concerns before even a single publication of Blue Stocking had taken place. That said, though, it did serve as a strong literary vehicle for women's issues, attempting to bring a new legitimacy to matters even if a larger paradigm shift did not itself occur. These sentiments concerning social constructions of women and womanhood did not simply make their way into political periodicals either, but also into more common forms of literature. With new translations of Western literature like Louisa May Alcott's Little Women in the 1910s, Japanese writers like Yoshia Nobuko authored stories in which there was emphasis placed on romantic friendships between two women, rather than the good wife, wise mother sentiment that was more prominently expected of women in Meiji-era Japan. These romantic friendships were not necessarily love in the sense of eternally spending your life with someone in pure romantic bliss, but love in the sense of eternally strong platonicism and emotional bonds, rather than something regarding sex or sexual attraction. Also serving as inspiration for this new fiction was the then wholly new all-woman theater troupe, the Takarazuka Revue, which still exists and regularly performs today. Featuring women playing men's roles, much like trouser roles in European theater traditions, romancing female roles was often a fixture of these stories, and according to ethnologist Jennifer Robertson in 1982, these played-by-female male characters, called otokoyaku, were able to negotiate both male and female genders and the social roles they must assume, without being constrained by either of them. Additionally, a Japanese audience at the time would likely have been able to perceive this negotiation, hence the enduring popularity of the Takarazuka into the present day, especially among married women. Whether this particular type of gendered exercising or not was taking place varies depending on the individual story, but the point is that within the arts, there was a push against the perceived normalcy of Japanese gender and sexual expectation and behaviors for women through this new kind of fiction. This type of fiction reorienting Japanese female-female sexuality would become known as Class S, and eventually developed its own storytelling convention and practices, such as the emphasis on the senpai-kohai dynamic, as well as a more stereotypically masculine female character and a more stereotypically feminine female character as integral to making the story work. Vestiges of Class S frameworks, with or without the tropes that I just mentioned, still permeate throughout much of current anime-manga. If you've watched the somewhat recent anime adaptation or are reading the ongoing manga Yuri is My Job, this Class S-ness is the kind of aesthetic that the show is deliberately tinkering with in its play-acted cafe setting, just to isolate one specific example. Unfortunately, however, Class S did not necessarily alter or shift larger social frameworks pertaining to female sexuality, in part because it unintentionally solidified a stereotype about young female adolescent sexuality. According to Aaron Subramanian, what it did was support the notion that homosexuality is tolerated only within the rather specific context of teenage girls, and that once that period has passed, such inclinations would fade as though it were just a phase, which is even today still often used as a rhetoric to disparage and undermine sexual awakening in adolescents and adults. Actual lesbians were viewed as something akin to an other, and it is not outside the realm of possibility to assume that lesbians were viewed as being from the West, since the Meiji era ushered in these new thoughts and ideologies concerning Japanese society through foreign integration. So, despite Class S literature's tinkering with sexual normalcy, its ability to depict genuine lesbian romance and relationships, and shatter preconceptions surrounding them, remained out of the loop. Now, how does all of this lead to Yuri manga within shoujo? Well, let's take a look at the history of shoujo manga for a minute. Chapter 2. An absurdly brief history of shoujo manga. I heard somewhere that if you separate the various sections of your video by calling them chapters, it increases your legitimacy by 22%, and I'm a clout-chasing loser, so of course I'm going to do that. Itself started in the Meiji era. Early shoujo manga was primarily concerned with being shorter stories deriving most of their entertainment value from humor or occasional tomboy characters. This is worth noting because even in its earlier form, when the medium was still principally dominated by male authors rather than female authors, shoujo manga was introducing gender expectation and thwarting. As for where to find manga like these, well, according to Jennifer Prough, censorship and rationing in the mid-1930s meant that many comics either folded or were greatly reduced, which is to say nothing of the natural degradation of paper and ink over time. And as time marched into the 1960s and television became a genuine competitor for entertainment, a massive influx of shoujo manga written by women started dominating weekly publications, trying to stay ahead. The simpler and more comedically oriented storytelling of older shoujo manga still definitely existed and permeated the medium, but there was a push into making shoujo manga more narratively and thematically diverse. God, there's so much pushing going on in this history, isn't there? Towards the end of the 1960s, men started leaving shoujo manga behind to write more shonen-oriented content, and new female mangaka during the Showa era sought a reimagining of shoujo manga into something more serious. In part inspired by works and cultures of Western countries, much like their Meiji-era ancestors, as well as the increasing new left rising in Japan, which means, yes, you can in fact even tangentially thank communism for Yuri manga. Shoujo expanded to include material that was more in line with the older audience-oriented Gekiga shonen manga, to contrast the more child-friendly manga style popularized by forebearers like Tezuka Osamu. Among the changes included larger diversification of tones like tragedy, and an attempt to break out of the traditional paneling format to put more emphasis on superimposing and more stylized detail. Genres such as science fiction, historical fiction, fantasy, horror, and, most significantly for the sake of our discussion here, a greater focus on same-sex relationships, both male-male and female-female. Unlike the previous Class S literature of the Meiji era, the stories by these new mangaka were less about romantic friendship and more about romantically amorous and sexual intent, a greater focus on actual portrayals of lesbians and/or lesbian sexual identity in manga, or at least the closest thing to that up to this point. This group of mangaka is collectively called the Year 24 group, itself referring to the fact that several of the mangaka associated with the movement were born in the 24th year of the Showa era. Though they are not really a unified artistic movement, despite occasionally sharing ideas and housing each other for creative purposes, and there is even some debate about who should be sorted into it, the Year 24 group is known for being the ones who essentially pushed the themes and conventions of Class S into shoujo manga, expanding their scope and reach such that we could nowadays more appropriately refer to it as the creation of the Yuri genre. It's important to state that Yuri as a term has undergone numerous changes, meanings, and interpretations both by Japanese and non-Japanese audiences since the term started being cultivated in Borazoku, Japan's first commercial gay man's magazine. As such, any singular interpretation about what Yuri is should be taken with a grain of salt. This also leads back to a point I've hinted at several times about genre being unnecessarily frustrating or useless as a concept, but that's besides the point. But that provision about Yuri's ambiguity as a distinction does create a problem in trying to find the first Yuri manga. At what point do we consider a forebearer to be the origin, or should we point to where it seemed to cement into something more concretely recognizable? Art very rarely has clean distinctions like these, so we are left to try and parse out where things lie. For the purposes of this video, and my own understanding of the Yuri genre as a whole, I do believe that publication within the Year 24 group does provide us with an answer. In 1971, mangaka Yamagishi Ryoko, in an issue of Reborn Comic, created a one-shot called Couple in the White Room, or Shiroi Heya no Futari. Having created some previous manga in the 60s, occasionally in the style of fairy tales like Tinkerbell or concerning dancing, Couple in the White Room stands as her most enduring and famous work. Released multiple times beyond its original printing, it is, if not the first Yuri manga proper, certainly one of the earliest that also happens to be the most available regarding obtaining it either in print or online. Regardless of whether or not it was the first Yuri manga or not, many of the lasting archetypes and iconographies which would become associated with Yuri both during this period and beyond it would crystallize in this single volume. So let's take a look at what exactly Couple in the White Room is doing. One thing to note is that because this manga is so short at only 80 pages, there will be major spoilers from here on out. Now, let's dive in. Chapter 3. Couple in the White Room. A view from inside a room, staring out a window. A countryside with a looming black cloud overhead. A small verse poem. Stroll behind the sacred porcelain statue. Within those folded wings, a secret darkness. Therein lies the crossroad of our hearts. The stone angel returning to the sun, like the feathers of Icarus. Within only its first page, Couple in the White Room has already begun to set its tone overall, both in the imagery of its illustrations and the tone of its words at the bottom of the page. Based on the architecture seen in the background, we can quickly presume that this is not Japan, and indeed, it isn't. As the story continues, we learn of a girl with a lovely face and beautiful hair, but sad eyes. Her name is Résine de Poisson, and she'll be enrolling at a massive boarding school. The reason for her stay becomes clear. Despite the protestation of her aunt, Résine has no desire to live with her. Having lost both her parents in a terrible accident, she does not want her family's wealth to go to the aunt. At least, that's what she suspects is the real reason for the aunt opposing the move to the school. Almost immediately, we are struck with the realization that Résine is, in both the spiritual and familial sense, alone. With her closest family taken away from her, and the little family that she has left possibly being more concerned with the material benefits of taking her in, rather than the girl herself, Résine has been forced to grow up rather quickly. She has come to view the behavior of those who are supposedly the most within her circle with a kind of cynicism and skepticism. Her coming to the school to live there is a form of personal rebellion against the perceived machinations of her aunt. It is not simply that, however. Moving to a boarding school is, in essence, her ability to start over and reinvent herself, away from the previous thoughts and people who plagued her. While it's true that her mother graduated from the same school, there is an underlying self-serving element here to achieve a new sense of happiness. When I say self-serving, I do not mean that in the negative sense. We all do self-serving things all the time because we feel that they are necessary, and given Résine's pessimism about things, we can assume that she thinks this is the only way that there is to reclaim some sense of agency. Greeted by a nun and guided by another woman, Résine is brought to the titular White Room where she will be staying during her time at the place, and we now understand it's a Catholic school. Her roommate, Simone Dark, is not there. Résine pensively asks herself, what kind of girl is Simone? Even here, it's worth pausing to remark that Simone has not been introduced properly to the material yet, and already a surprisingly intriguing profile of her has begun to take shape. On the surface, Simone's lack of presence seems rude. It cannot be that difficult to simply wait for someone and greet them when they arrive. But such an action already demonstrates a commonality between the two characters, a fundamental mistrust or, at the very least, discontent with superiors and authority, marching to the beat of their own drums compared to what is perhaps expected of them. It is only within 4 pages of Couple in the White Room that a kind of assertion concerning so-called proper female behavior is called into question. The key difference, however, lies in the intent. Résine trades one form of choking social circumstances for an entirely separate one that, according to her aunt, will just choke her within a month to the point that she'll return home, while Simone seems to just disregard the expected conduct of the school altogether and be as independent as possible. It's only when Résine takes a stroll outside and cries, reminiscing about her mother, that Simone is finally seen, and here we have one of Yuri manga's primary signifiers. Compared to Résine, Simone is, in several ways, her complete opposite. Résine's hair is whiter, and she wears a rather plain dress along with a bow in her hair. Simone has none of these things. Her hair is jet black, unadorned with any decorations or accoutrements, and she wears longer legwear with an eye-catching pattern. In several ways, it is the most simplistic visual understanding of the adage opposites attract, but it does speak to the, perhaps, more innate desire to be fascinated by that which is different. It should be mentioned that prior to this point, the only thought that Résine had about Simone was not that it was rude of her to not greet her in the room, but simply wondering what kind of girl she was. If by pure visual aesthetic alone there is enough to distinguish Simone as separate from her, from all that we've seen thus far, then what other possible traits does Simone have compared to Résine? And, well, Résine soon learns. Simone is brusque and rude, laughing at having seen Résine cry and saying rather plainly that she doesn't like crying children. As she sneers at others at dinner time, she also manages to sneak out at night and call Résine a mama's girl when she returns. The emotional chasm between Résine and Simone is thus established. The initial reading of such an encounter would make it appear on the surface that Résine is the more mature one, while Simone is immature, that anyone who makes fun of a character crying for their deceased mother is a vulture at best, or an outright heartless bitch at worst. It's best punctuated when Simone asks the sharp question, really, what's so good about a mother? Everything that Simone does seems poised to make Résine somehow seem meek and weak, someone who would be easily stepped on. It's no wonder, therefore, why the other schoolmates seem to have their own unflattering perspectives on Simone. Even though Simone's personal history is not yet known, it's quite clear that she does not conform to the expectations laid out for her from her own classmates. From physical appearance to mannerisms in the social setting, Simone is an island unto herself. And as a result, she is in that sense alone, just like Résine is. But unlike Résine, who joined the school to get away from the people that she didn't belong with, Simone seems to be taking every step possible to get away from the school and its people. It thus raises the fascinating narrative question. If Simone is able to escape the grounds and go wherever she goes, then what is to stop her from simply staying away forever? We get our answer not long after. For a moment, it seems like Simone's assumptions about Résine and her weak constitution are correct, as she faints during a school assembly. As she comes to, she initially thinks she sees her mother, when in actuality it is Simone who has escorted her to the medical center. Résine thus sees two sides of Simone, the one who is willing to be crass and non-conforming, and the one who is also willing to be a little more playful and even, dare I say, kind. Because Résine is exposed to both sides of Simone, her curiosity about Simone can only grow, as though Simone is a mystery that's waiting to be unlocked, with Résine getting more focused on Simone's physique and ability, admiring her as she plays tennis. When rejecting the idea of playing tennis herself and Simone mocking her for being the type of person who won't do things because they make her look bad, it serves as a form of character motivation for Résine. The constant simultaneous attraction to and repulsion of Simone by her mannerisms is the manga's way of introducing the attraction and repulsion of the more romantic and sexual element that eventually will work its way into the story. But things eventually come to their first head when, after seemingly cheating off of Résine's homework, Simone refuses to recite the required T.S. Eliot poem in class, and instead recites something else.
Once I have known her, I must die. For that shining smile that is so difficult to describe, I must die. For those light, delicate hands, I must die. For her, I must. Before
being cut off. This excerpt comes from Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke, translated as, "We must die because we have known them," speaking of the beautifully terrifying power that women have over men, and how the distance between men and women's ephemerality leaves men quivering and helpless. Naturally, there are no male main characters in Couple in the White Room, but the sentiment is nevertheless expressed in this particular matter. The point is that Simone's usage of the poem here is thus the first truly overt sign of her feelings for Résine, showing that underneath the colder exterior, Simone has herself developed a deep fascination with Résine despite the emotional distance between them. And that distance closes rapidly. On Parents' Day, it's revealed that Simone's mother is a famous actress, but Simone absolutely reviles her since she has not kept in contact and simply left Simone at the school for years on end. This outburst, complete with a role reversal of Résine seeing Simone cry as she runs away in sadness, recontextualizes the initial framing of Résine and Simone's relationship. Simone's actions are not immaturity for the sake of simply defying decency or etiquette or being cold, but rather the result of an emotional barrenness of love that she had been denied by her own mother, with no proper healthy outlet to vent those frustrations. Though she's actually only in the manga for a few pages, Simone's mother and Simone make for an interesting comparison. Simone's mother is at the height of the acting world, partaking in the adoration and adulation of many despite her taste in young men and other sexual proclivities. Simone is, in some ways, quite similar. She, as we'll soon see, has acting chops, and, according to her classmates, makes a habit of having new dates or partners almost every evening. But the critical difference lies elsewhere. Simone's mother is able to do what she does because she is so loved, seemingly having all the time in the world for these many luxuries and pleasantries, but cannot be persuaded to spend even a little time with her daughter, even in correspondence. Simone does what she does because she is so othered by her fellow classmates, and even though they evidently love her athleticism and acting abilities too, Simone does not actively use those things to take advantage of their goodwill to engage in her own sexual proclivities with them. Despite Simone's delinquent behavior, her own resentment of her mother is what ultimately keeps her from becoming her, no matter how much their behaviors may align. Thus, the chasm between the two main girls is given its bridge. Simone and Raisin's emotional compasses are rooted in abandonment and loneliness, with Raisin having lost both her mother and father in an accident, while Simone's father is nowhere to be found and she doesn't even necessarily know which of her mother's many partners is her real father. Love from both girls' families is either denied or repurposed for the sake of conveniences, appearances, or monetary gains rather than resembling anything akin to actual familial love. It also therefore puts into perspective that it is within their relationship that they both can allow themselves to be candid and honest, where the other person that they know is the only one they know is not lying. This matters because Simone crying is perhaps the most blatantly honest act that she has done up to this point of the manga. To take a certain psychological reading, Simone has relied upon her mother not being around to mask her own frailty, thus building her reputation as a ne'er-do-well so that she can have an image to fall back on in case someone tries to befriend her. She would reject the idea of friendship because no one could ever truly understand her feelings. To see the image that Simone had constructed for herself break is unthinkable, since it not only means having to reconcile the influence of the one person she hates more than anyone else, but also because the perception of Simone from other people would likewise change as well. Thus, her earlier actions of antagonism towards Raisin are interpreted as a means to maintain that strong facade. What better way to maintain your image than to erect it in front of someone entirely new? Simone making fun of Raisin longing for her mother is thus less about lying to Raisin than it is about lying to herself, which is vastly more painful. Mocking Raisin was, in essence, Simone's attempt to recognize and mask her own insecurity. But this is why the moment of Raisin finding Simone crying at the fountain also matters. For Simone, who cried in front of Raisin and understands now that Raisin does not in fact hate her or her display of weakness, perhaps feels for the first time that she can lower the defenses she has built for herself, as someone now actually does understand her loneliness. It may not have been purposeful, but Raisin found out, and there's nothing really to hide anymore. Whatever malice Simone may have felt towards Raisin, and what she reminded Simone of, no longer matters. Thus, in the immortal moment, Simone kisses Raisin by the fountain. Thus, their moment of connection is truly forged, and their destinies intertwine with one another in romance. There is one other way to interpret this, that the reason for Simone's kiss has less to do with loving Raisin specifically, and more to do with wanting to fill a kind of absence in her emotional health that her mother was never able to provide. To put it another way, Simone is mapping her longing for familial love onto Raisin specifically because she too comes from a place of familial unlove. It could somewhat explain Simone's contrasting behaviors towards Raisin throughout the story, at times coming to her aid and at other times berating her longing for her own mother and supposed weakness. This is further complicated by the manga's short length of only about 80-some pages, which means that some of the melodramatic leaps are left a little unexplored and there can only be so much discussion about it. But then again, I've been talking about this manga for the better part of, well, several minutes, so what the hell do I know? With Simone and Raisin having had their moment, the school puts on Romeo and Juliet because shut up, with Simone balking at the idea of playing Romeo. Again, it's that matter about things that connect her to her mother that makes her short-circuit a little, but she changes her mind when Raisin is cast as Juliet. There's a rather brief comment by the teacher in which he says that it is okay for two girls to kiss on stage because they're two girls, which actually harkens back to the old attitude regarding female sexuality that I mentioned before. Expressions of romantic friendship between two women is acceptable, but only within certain specific contexts, though Yuri fans would likely recognize its usage in the acclaimed Bloom Into You, and theater fans would certainly recognize its usage in the Takarazuka. Theater, or acting in general, is often used, whether in or outside of Yuri manga, in order to allow explorations of character dynamics or sexuality that would otherwise not be allowed in other circumstances. The Sakura Wars movie does so in its final extended sequence. The manga Boy Meets Maria wields this dramatic vehicle quite tightly, and Review Starlight maximizes its theatricality to have its characters clash in surreal space. Because of the nature of theater, Résine and Simone can have an actual kiss between them on stage, and the assumption is that it's purely for the play, and not a reflection of any actual sincerity between them. The audience doesn't even necessarily realize that underlying illusion. This matters since, after the kiss, Simone makes the point of saying that their kiss was, to her, not an act, and that after pulling Résine away from her family since they were bothering her, says that she loves her. In her second full display of honesty, Simone essentially bears her full emotional center, but at the cost of the sight of one of the other classmates happening to glimpse from afar the two girls' closeness. Even though Résine breaks away from Simone temporarily, it doesn't stop a rumor from spreading about Résine and Simone being lesbians, or as the manga refers to them, lesbos. Résine's sheer panic at the very implication that she could be a lesbian thus kicks off the final arc of the manga, and the most brutal of its emotional turbulences. Résine's woe at the implication is countered with Simone expressing genuine worry about her, but rather than manifesting as a physical malady like she thinks, it lies in the metaphysical cross-space of actual sexuality with perceived sexuality. Simone bears no mind to the implication that she's a lesbian, but Résine's insistence that all she feels is friendship is countered by Simone's refrain of not telling lies. But perhaps in an effort to appease Résine's woe, Simone offers to introduce her to some guys to get a boyfriend, which Résine takes up as an offer. After meeting Simone's friends, including Marcel, who evidently has had the hots for Simone for a while, Résine strikes up conversation with a boy named Bruno, yet cannot help but notice Simone's popularity with all the people there, including Marcel. And yet, at the end of the gathering, despite getting a promise to spend more time with Bruno, Résine cries and collapses into Simone, insisting that Simone forgot about her and went to go have fun with her other friends. In another moment of unapologetic and unobfuscated tenderness, Simone holds the crying Résine, and while Résine finally acknowledges that perhaps she really does love Simone, that accursed rumor of the two girls being lesbians rears its ugly head within her mind. And therein lies Résine's final dilemma. To cherish or possess Simone romantically comes with the need to reconcile Simone's own desire for her, and both forces act in consistent conflict with Résine's own preoccupation about what she perceives as her own sexuality. Simone's presence would be, much like Simone's own mother with her, the acknowledgement of a supposed weakness that she possesses, that whatever image she has of herself cannot be smudged or, to use a rather particular word, defiled. Thus she maps the notion of a lesbian relationship as something immoral or simply not the case between them, at least from her own perspective. The well, however, runs even deeper. Recall earlier in the video that I mentioned that Résine has an inherent skepticism toward the people who ostensibly love her, and that her efforts to come to the boarding school are an attempt to effectively reinvent herself into something new? The problem is that her reaction to Simone's genuine confession, and reconciling her own emotional burdens, has also, perhaps unintentionally, left Résine skeptical of her own self and the young woman that she has become. She has allowed herself to feel actual affective love for the first time since her parents passed away, and yet because the source of the new love is from another woman, it means acknowledging a transformation into someone that she seemingly does not want to transform into. As far as Résine is concerned, she can feel love for someone else, but only so long as it is not Simone, and God help her if it's just another woman in general. Hence why Résine spends increasingly more time with Bruno, implying that she kisses him at one point and tells herself as a kind of mission statement that she must fall in love with him. She partakes in the kind of behavior that Simone is accused of doing by her fellow classmates, going out and being with a man, but Simone doesn't necessarily do it for the purposes of finding new partners. For Résine, the purpose is asserting her own presumed heterosexuality, determined to keep her love for Simone locked behind a window. Hence why, in one of the best panels of the manga, Simone can only look out the window, a frown on her face that's eerily reminiscent of Résine's original look when she arrived at the school. With Résine insisting that she loves Bruno and that Simone is merely a friend, Résine's remark serves as the final dagger. She did the one thing that Simone hates more than anything else, lying, and not just a run-of-the-mill lie, but a lie that centers around love concerning the people in her life. Raisin's refusal to even entertain the idea that she has truly romantic feelings for Simone is the culmination of something that Simone mentioned earlier about Raisin refusing to play tennis. Remember earlier in the manga that Raisin rejected playing tennis with Simone because she would, as Simone reasoned, look bad while doing so. Acknowledging her homosexuality is thus to voluntarily subject herself to one type of humiliation over another. To Raisin, the intrinsic humiliation of lying about her sexuality to maintain a heterosexual facade is something that she can live with because the extrinsic humiliation of her classmates' scorn and gossip is intolerable to her. Caught within this tension, Raisin's sexual agency is effectively paralyzed, never being able to be with the person she actually loves, versus never being able to love the person she thinks she wants to love. But there's another, more understated angle to consider as well. It is not just that Raisin would be labeled a lesbian, a label that during Couple in the White Room seems tinged with ridicule and mocking othering, but also that she's a lesbian with the school's biggest rogue, markedly more uncouth and unrefined compared to the many other women who exist in that same space. As readers for Couple in the White Room, we're made aware of Simone's greater emotional complexity, actions, and motivations, and have also seen evidence that now that Simone has been so forthcoming with Raisin about her own feelings, there is no reason to believe that Simone would forget her or mistreat her. If anything, the Simone of the manga's latter half is a transformation of the antagonistic, almost brutish character that we had seen previously. This new Simone is a Simone that held Raisin as she cried, showed concern for her health, was willing to entertain the idea of getting Raisin a boyfriend if it meant creating some kind of stability, acting in a play even though she has no aspirations to be an actress like her horrible mother, and the like. But readers knowing that, and bearing witness to it all, is not the same thing as the characters within the story being privy to this information. The only things that they know about Simone for sure are the behaviors that she exhibits to them every day, and whatever their rumors manage to conjure about her, truthful or otherwise. Both from the perspective of the surrounding social structure of the school and her own desperate attempts to assert her debatably existent heterosexuality, Raisin opts to reject Simone's love outright. Within the story, it is framed as the ultimate lie. "I cannot become like you," she says. With such a cold rejection and running away in the pouring rain, including dropping out of the school and moving away elsewhere, all Simone can do now is the other thing that she hates more than lying, and that's cry. And yet in her moment of losing consciousness from exhaustion and illness, Raisin calls out Simone's name one last time. Cutting away to about a month later, Raisin seems to have recovered and moved on. But that's when Simone's fate is revealed, that she was murdered by Marcel. Calling Runeau on the phone and meeting him in person again after so long, we learn exactly what happened. After Raisin left, Simone began spiraling down a path of self-destruction, drinking far more than she normally did and antagonizing Marcel over his love for her and rejecting him outright, claiming that she was forever in love with someone else. Goading him into killing her, Simone was stabbed with Marcel's knife, and as she realized she was dying, thought of Raisin in her dying moments. With her mother already having left soon after Simone's funeral and leaving Simone's friends and her mother's lawyer to fix matters, Raisin learns that one of Simone's final letters, marked with Raisin's name, contains the Rilke poem from earlier in the story. Raisin, consumed by distraught, resolves to never love anyone else again as repentance for rejecting the girl who loved her. Simone's love for her was real, and it is only in Simone's death that Raisin realizes just how much her own love for Simone was just as real too, and how her own cowardice and suffering brought about both girls' final doom. This remark about never falling in love again is worth expanding on just a little further, in part because of how much it differs from previous depictions in other stories. It's effectively the ultimate subversion of the alleged just a phase attitude regarding female adolescent sexuality from Class S. By making such a statement and adhering to it, if you believe in the idea of a life for the characters after the final chapter, Raisin essentially breaks the barrier of sexual time to fully embody and express who she is. It is not just the mourning of Simone that Raisin is doing, it is effectively declaring her own homosexuality and saying, "Here was the woman that I loved, and loved so much that I will not let anyone replace her." It is a simultaneous closing and liberation of her sexual agency. In choosing to renounce love and however it may come to her in the future, she is finally allowed to feel and express that which she had neglected, misunderstood, and repressed for so long. We see, at last, the real her that perhaps Simone herself saw, but could not reach. That is not to say that the Résine of the manga being confused is somehow not the real her either, but because that was just as real. Rather, we see a Résine who now fully grasps her emotional compass, with its magnetic north pointing to the memory and loss of her love, the tragedy of which is that it is only in death that she finally understands the significance of to whom that compass was pointing towards, the fascinating girl with a beautiful physique, jet black hair, some delinquent tendencies, but a heart that allowed itself the freedom to live and love unapologetically. If only Résine could have done the same. Chapter 4. Post-Manga Follow-Up. I know that was a lot to take in, but we're almost done here, I promise. Looking at this manga with current sensibilities, Couple in the White Room seems rather, shall we say, trite or by the numbers, not to mention a little melodramatic in the eye-rolling rather than the engrossing sense. It's easy to forget that aspects of the Yuri genre that seem commonplace now were once not the case, and that this manga was an attempt to, so to speak, venture into the wilderness and see what the unknown had to offer. I cannot say for sure, but I do not think that Yamagishi was consciously thinking about how this specific manga would help shape manga moving forward, but the reverberations and effect long afterward are still felt and clung to. The Yuri fandom in anime is not insubstantial, and while it would be easy to dismiss Yuri fascination as the predominantly male anime community thinking that two girls or two women kissing is hot,
Woo! Yeah, baby! That's what I've been waiting for!
I think that there's a little too simplistic of an explanation in there. It may explain Yuri's popularity now, but not necessarily back then. To perhaps bring a little perspective to the matter, let's try reframing that by asking a more fundamental question. Why do we gravitate towards stories that depict societal taboo, either within our own societies or within other contexts? We are, in some ways, drawn to that which is foreign to us. We experience stories sometimes for the purposes of either exploring new places or understanding new people that are decidedly not of our own familiarity. And this includes the exploration of ideas, personalities, or actions that we may not necessarily condone ourselves, but are nevertheless curious to see how they would function even within a fictional universe. Just take a look at the medium that we claim to love so much. International anime fans are not born and raised in Japan, and being able to experience anime or manga affords the chance to gaze through the window at another part of the world whose artistic sensibilities our own culture likely never would have provided us, or at least not provided us in the same manner. Of course, how well this is managed varies from property to property and person to person. What exactly is foreign or unknown to us with Couple in the White Room? As insinuated before, the manga argued that female homosexuality could run far deeper and more heartfelt, long-lasting, and personally world-breaking than Class S romantic friendships, or what Japanese society as a whole would readily accept. From a purely Japanese perspective, the manga takes place in a non-Japanese location, which is a trait that binds a lot of Year 24 group manga together and serves the work as a benefit rather than a detraction. If we are to assume that Aaron Subramian's previous assertions about lesbians coming from the West has merit, then it makes sense that this manga would take place there, in France specifically. Displacing the location away from Japan affords a kind of space for dealing with societal taboo because, in a sense, it is easier to portray transgressive behavior far from your own shores or home. Whether it is Ikeda Ryoko's Rose of Versailles taking place on the cusp of the French Revolution, Izawa Man and Igarashi Yumiko's Georgie taking place in Australia and London, or the numerous other examples that exist, Year 24 group manga used location as a form of exploring these types of stories when the native country may not have accommodated them. Even Ryoko's Onisama-e, despite taking place in Japan, uses a school setting that is more like a Western private school rather than the stereotypical sailor uniforms and skirts of a Japanese school. And though tragedy is not something that was created with the Yuri genre in the 1970s, Couple in the White Room codified the idea that stories of this nature, or where female homosexuality was a character feature and the primary defining story element, were more likely to end with tragedy. The tragedy outcome is predestined within the very rigidity, paranoia, and presupposition of the outside world's attitudes concerning sexuality among young Japanese women, and how those manifest in the characters' internal struggles. If the manga had both Raisin and Simone ending with a more happily ever after emotionality, what ripple would the material possibly have made? It's impossible to know for sure, but here's another way to look at it. As it exists, Couple in the White Room dared to explore a sexual world in which the conventions of the real world's social structure influenced the social structure of the manga in its darker realizations, even in locations or peoples that did not necessarily subscribe to or take place in Japanese locations. Is it melodramatic? Certainly. But melodrama done well always manages to grasp the visceral, brazen emotionality of raw and unfiltered feeling. And for a Japanese society that today still has some difficulties reconciling the legality of homosexuality among its citizens, what could be more daring than saying that this paralysis, as seen firsthand in Raisin's own paralyzing woe, has the power to kill or destroy something sincere and heartfelt? And this was touched upon in 1971. It was perhaps not the cleanest step in the world, but it was at least something. Decades later, there's still a long way to go, and many steps still to be taken. If you have never read Couple in the White Room before, especially if you consider yourself someone who really likes Yuri material, or someone who just finds the history of anime manga interesting, I highly recommend giving this manga a read. It doesn't take very long, and though the art style might take some time to get used to, it is a monument to one of shoujo's most significant flashpoints in regards to the medium's development in terms of the range of ideas that it was willing to explore. Art history almost never is a, pardon the word choice here, straight path from point A to point Z, or point Z for those of you who live outside the United States. So when particularly important developments in the road take place, take a minute and walk the path and see what happened. In this case, the path led to a school with a white room and two girls whose lives changed and birthed a new sensibility. Once I have known her, I must die. For that shining smile that is so difficult to describe, I must die. For those light, delicate hands, I must die. For her, I must. A special thank you to my patron Issy, who also provided the voice for Simone earlier in this video. And a sincere thank you for watching. Feel free to like, comment, subscribe, share, and click that bell for notifications so you never miss another upload. Feel free to donate to my Patreon or follow my social media accounts, links in the video's description. In the meantime, this has been ZNote of ZNoteTaku. Happy Pride Month, and happy viewing, everyone.